1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case. The Chief Justice, whose portrait you see here, was nearing his 80th year. As a young Maryland lawyer, Taney had once declared that
slavery is a blot upon our national character, and every lover of freedom hopes that it will be wiped away.
Those were not just words to Taney. Soon after that, he had freed his own slaves. Would he now, many observers wondered, free Dred Scott as well? The Chief Justice began by reviewing the facts of Dred Scott's case. Then he dropped the first of two judicial bombshells. Scott, Taney ruled, could not sue for his freedom in a federal court because he was not a citizen. Nor could he ever become a citizen. No African American, whether slave or free, could become an American citizen. Next, Taney dropped bombshell number 2. He rejected Scott's argument that his stay in territory where slavery was banned by the Missouri Compromise had made him a free man. The reason was simple. The Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional. Taney's argument went something like this. Slaves are property. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that property cannot be taken from people without due process of law or a court hearing. If Congress banned slavery in a territory, the effect is the same as taking property away from slaveholders who would like to bring their slaves into that area. And this is unconstitutional. In fact, Congress has a responsibility under the Constitution to protect the property rights of slaveholders in the territories. As you can imagine, slaveholders were delighted by the Dred Scott decision. They hoped that the issue of slavery in the territories was finally settled. Anti-slavery Northerners, however, were stunned and enraged by the court's ruling. One New York newspaper ran bold headlines declaring that
the decision of the Supreme Court is the moral assassination of a race and cannot be obeyed.
Controversy over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, anti-slavery activists formed a new political organization called the Republican Party. The Republicans were united by their belief that
no man can own another man, that slavery must be prohibited in the territories, that all new states must be free states, that the rights of our colored citizens must be protected, and that in the course of God's providence nothing can be called final which is wrong.
In 1858, Republicans in Illinois nominated a tall, lanky lawyer named Abraham Lincoln to run for the Senate. In his speech accepting this honor, Lincoln pointed out that all attempts to compromise the slavery issue had failed. Then, quoting from the Bible, the candidate said gravely,
"A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free."
Lincoln's opponent in this race was Senator Stephen Douglas. In Douglas's mind, there was no reason why the nation could not go on indefinitely half slave and half free. And so when Lincoln challenged him to debate the slavery issue, Douglas readily agreed. As you look at this picture of the two debaters, you can see why Douglas was known as the Little Giant, and Lincoln as Long Abe. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Little Giant argued repeatedly that the Dred Scott decision had put the slavery issue to rest. Lincoln disagreed. In his eyes, slavery was a moral, not a legal issue. The debate on this moral question, said Lincoln,
will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world.
Lincoln lost the election to Douglas, but Long Abe was not discouraged. He wrote to a friend saying,
"The fight must go on. The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats."
When you last met John Brown, the man you see in this photograph, he was leading raids against pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. When things got too hot for Brown there, he and his followers headed north to Canada. In 1859, Brown returned to the United States determined to end slavery forever. His plan was to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He would use the weapons stored there to arm the slaves of Maryland and Virginia. Then he would lead those slaves in a glorious rebellion that would destroy slavery across the South. It was a mad scheme. Brown and his men did capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, but within hours, soldiers had surrounded the building and killed or captured all of Brown's band. John Brown was quickly tried, convicted of treason, and sentenced to death. On the day of his hanging, he left a note in his jail cell that read,
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
Northerners were divided over Brown. Some viewed him as a lunatic, a crazy criminal who deserved his fate. Others saw him as a hero, even a saint. The black abolitionist Robert Purvis wrote of Brown that he nobly acted what he nobly thought, and sealed by death the lessons which he taught. He believed that the black man was a man, and he laid down his life to secure for him the rights of a man. Brown's words and deeds struck terror in the hearts of white Southerners. If a great slave uprising were to take place, it was their blood that would be shed. In their fear, whites drew together. Never before, reported a South Carolina newspaper, has the South been more united in sentiment and feeling. The South may have been united as a result of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, but as this presidential election map of 1860 shows, the nation as a whole was desperately divided. At first, the 1860 presidential race looked like it would be a repeat of the recent Illinois Senate race. The Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. The Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. But when Douglas refused to come out firmly in favor of slavery, his party split apart. Southern Democrats nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. To make this election even more confusing, a group calling themselves the Constitution Union Party nominated John Bell of Tennessee to run for president. With his opposition divided three ways, Lincoln sailed to victory. But it was a strange sort of victory. First, Lincoln won with just 40% of the votes cast. Second, as the election map shows, he had absolutely no support in the South. All of Lincoln's votes came from the northern states. For white Southerners, the message of this election was unmistakable. The South had become a minority section. It no longer had the power to shape national policies and events. Sooner or later, Congress would probably try to abolish slavery, and when that happened, the South would be ruined. A South Carolina newspaper wrote,
The ruin of the South by the emancipation of her slaves is not like the ruin of other people. It is the loss of liberty, property, home country, everything that makes life worth living.
In the weeks following the election, talk of secession filled the air. A few senators became so alarmed that they formed a committee to search for yet another compromise on slavery. They knew that this would not be easy. Still, they had to do something, and do it fast, if they were to stop the South's rush toward disunion and disaster. The Senate Compromise Committee held its first meeting on December 20th, 1860. But as the senators began their work, events in two distant cities dashed their hopes for a peaceful settlement. The first event occurred in Springfield, Illinois, at the home of President-elect Abraham Lincoln. On that day, Lincoln was asked whether he could support some sort of compromise on slavery. His answer was clear. He would not interfere with slavery in the South. He would even support enforcement of the fugitive slave law. But, Lincoln added,
Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery.
On that same day, delegates attending a state convention in Charleston, South Carolina, voted in favor of secession. The city went wild. Church bells rang and cannons boomed. Huge crowds filled the streets, roaring their enthusiastic approval. A South Carolina newspaper boldly proclaimed that the Union is dissolved. 6 more states soon followed South Carolina's lead. On March 4th, 1861, Lincoln was sworn in as President of the not-so-United States. His first duty as President, he said in his inauguration speech, was to defend the Constitution by keeping the nation together. Then Lincoln appealed to the rebellious states to return the Union in peace, saying,
In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war.
A month later, firebrands in Charleston, South Carolina, took this decision into their own hands. On April 12th, they opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor. In this picture of the bombardment, you can see the American flag still flying over the fort. After 36 hours of heavy shelling, the defenders of Fort Sumter hauled down the Stars and Stripes and replaced it with a white flag of surrender. The news that rebels had fired on the flag unleashed a wave of patriotic fury in the North. All doubts people had had about using force to save the Union vanished. A New York newspaper reported excitedly that
there is no more thought of bribing or coaxing the traitors who have dared to aim their cannonballs at the flag of the Union. Fort Sumter is temporarily lost, but the country is saved.
thus the Civil War began.